touched this pipeline in a while, like when I'm out of town, but everything looks like it's good, so... It's Monday, Mario Day 2025. I'm Rim.
I'm Scott.
And this is Geek Nights. Tonight, we are talking about MIDI. All right. Guess I got an openy bit. I should probably pull up the Wikipedia on MIDI in case I forget anything about it.
It's not that much to know. We don't have to talk about all the every technical detail, just the pertinent ones, and then the,
I do want to. I'm trying to. The one thing I want to remember is the name. There's the protocol. Oh, it's show control. That's the protocol to use MIDI to control lights and stuff that a lot of buildings implemented. I forgot what it was called. There it is. Talk a little about the history of MIDI. I did a lot of MIDI anyway. All right. Looks like everything's working. See, I was in Europe last week. A couple days in Frankfurt, a few days in London, and the only thing I can really say that's notable for all of you out there, you know, the listener, is that it should be obvious, and I don't think it is to a lot of Americans, but just spending a few days in Europe last week, anti-American sentiment is palpable. Like overheard conversations in pubs and bars, reactions to a blue passport from people, just conversations I had while I was there. We're entering an era of like a newfound nationalism united in the fact that America has fucked us for the last time in Europe so far.
So I would say, A, please conquer us. B.
Yep. Oh my God. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if the EU conquered us?
That'd be great.
Oh my God.
I'd help. But anyway,
the point is, not that they're perfect, but you know what? They're better than what we got.
The point is, the people, right? The fact that other people who are not Americans are angry at Americans, does not bother the Americans
who are the
that
problem.
They're angry at, and the Americans who are bothered by the fact that other decent people from other countries don't like us.
They're already voting for Democrats.
Are the people who don't are at the target of the hate.
Yep. So we need a sort of the opposite of a meet cute, like a meet angry. We got to somehow cause the Europeans to directly interact with the Americans who are the problem. But so this is even back home. So I landed back from Europe, Friday, and the air train would have taken about an hour and the cab would have taken like 20 minutes. So I did get in the cab. There's no line for cabs. And my cabbie is one of those cab drivers who wants to talk, like he wants to have a little chat. And I'm always game with that. That's always fun. And this guy is 78 years old. It was a hell of a conversation. This guy was cool. But basically, this dude, the cab takes off, and he asked me a couple of questions that are the kinds of questions I would ask a stranger if I was trying to figure out if they're a fascist or not before I decide what to do. So
maybe he was trying, but the thing is, the problem is you never know if the right answer is yes, I am, or no, I'm not.
So a strident individual, shall we say, you know me very well. I lean right into, oh, fuck that Nazi, like America's in deep shit. And this guy is like, yes. Good people.
Of course, he's a cab driver.
Yeah, this guy like had a lot.
The odds of the cab driver being the Nazi are really low.
Oh yeah, and the point he made was basically, we got to have these conversations with strangers just to remind regular people that the Nazis are the minority, and when push comes to shove, there's more of this than them. So this guy is like pointedly, every time he drives home from JFK, especially if they travel from overseas, he tries to figure out if they're a fascist. And what he said was, so far I haven't driven any of them anywhere. And
they're not at the airport.
And I don't know what I'll do if I find one.
Take them somewhere.
Just drop them off in the middle of the Bronx.
Take them for a ride. That's what your job is. Take them for a ride. Yeah.
But then also, total aside, just, openy bits, getting them all out here because I'll forget them all. Today, I'm at work. I'm forced to go into the office 4 days a week and yell into Zoom. And I go out for lunch. And I try to come back from lunch. And I hit the button to call an elevator. And we have a complicated system. And the system says, cannot allocate an elevator.
No, it's one of those ones where it's like, it's like this one's going to this floor, get in this one.
Yep, it's one of those systems.
Yep, you need those when the building's too big.
Yep. But yeah, so just couldn't allocate an elevator. And then I look up and I realize that there's a few people milling around. And then I discover that all the elevators in our high rise are dead. No elevators. So I can't get back to my desk to do a meeting. And
that happened in our apartment building like a week or two ago, I'd say. Something like
both
both elevators
in our building.
Yeah, I think it must have been a technical, not a mechanical error, but I think my guess is it's a technical error with the fire system, even though there wasn't any other problems.
It was a problem with the fire system at my work office today.
It caused all the elevators to go to the bottom floor and be stuck open, which is what you do when there's a fire, so that all the firefighters can get in them and use them, and normal people can't.
Yep. Fire mode is a very specific behavior that is regulated in elevators. It's also a huge security vulnerability, as Deviant Ulam likes to talk about in all his videos on elevator
Yeah, because
hacking.
the way it works is the elevators go to the bottom floor and they're all open. So that way firefighters can rush in the building, get in them, and use them. Well, how do the firefighters make them move? They have a key. That key is just the same key in every fucking building. You could probably buy the key on eBay or make the key or it's like anyone can get that key because it's the same key in every building. So if
it's even worse than that. That key is used by other non-elevator things. That is one of the most common keys in the fucking world.
I'm sure a lockpicking lawyer probably just sells the key or whatever. It doesn't matter. You just get that key. You go into any elevator pretty much anywhere, at least in the per city maybe, probably the whole world. I don't even fucking know. And you just make the elevator go wherever you want it to go. Whatever.
So I've got to get back up to my office, and there's a growing crowd of people. Like, this is a busy building, realizing the elevators are down. And I asked the security guards, like, can I just walk up the stairs? Because I don't do that. I haven't done that in years. Like, I'm in a hurry and I'm busy.
He's like, yeah, you have to. You have no choice.
Well, no. And they're like, no, don't. And I'm like, okay, why? And they're like, just don't. That's what we were told. So I just went around the corner where they couldn't see me, and I went into the stairs. I walked up, and as far as I can tell, the only reason they were telling people not to walk up is that the few people who started to walk up couldn't walk up 17 flights of stairs without having trouble.
Not everyone's got to go to the 17th floor. What about people going to the third floor?
The lowest floor we work on is the 9th floor.
Well, what about other companies? What's on floors 2 through 8?
We basically have the whole building, so...
What are you doing on floors 2 through 8? Nothing? Empty space?
It's complicated, but everyone we work with is between floors 8 and 23. I'm on the 17th floor.
Who's on floor 7?
That's not a thing you need to worry about.
Okay.
No
we got
one who
some
works with me is
classified
on that
secrets.
floor.
Everyone figure out where Rim's office is and find your way to the 7th floor. There's some secret shit there.
But so anyway, basically the only reason they were telling people not to walk up the stairs is that most people are incapable of walking up that many flights of stairs without trouble.
I mean, yeah. Also, I think maybe the reason they're not using the stairs is because you'll get access to floors 2 through 7, where there's clearly vampires and gold and
you actually won't. There is a funny thing. So there is in the company I work for, there is a badge of shame. So, you got a security badge, and we're the kind of company where you got to have your badge on all the time. Like, if you see someone without a badge, that is a big deal. Like, you can't get away with it. Fucking every door, you got to swipe this badge, like, all over the place. If you forget your badge, you either have to go home and get it, no matter how long that takes, and then you're mad, like, you get yelled at, basically. Or you have to be like, look, I lost my badge. Then you get in a different kind of trouble, and they give you this bullshit paper badge. It's huge. It's basically the scarlet letter of, I'm an idiot who lost my badge.
It's like a legal paper or a postboard.
It is the size of the Blades in the Dark role-playing game book that I'm holding out for.
Okay,
like,
so
it is
it's not
huge,
that big.
but it's pretty big. So not only do you have to wear this everywhere, it can only be scanned in the lobby. And if you go into the stairs, you cannot get back into any floor except the ground floor. So you are screwed until you get a real badge instead of this paper badge.
Okay.
I have never needed that badge in my life. I've never lost my badge. And somehow this is a problem for like everyone else except me. And I don't know how people like lose their badges, but whatever. Anyway, got any news?
Yeah, so you said today was Mario Day because it's March 10th and Nintendo's got the usual sales going on. I guess they failed to put the Switch 2 full announcement out on March 10th. We're going to have to wait a little while longer for that. But one thing they did do, like some days ago, not very long ago, is they added some more games to Nintendo Switch Online. And they added a very important game that I think people do not remember, or people are too young to even know about. And this is Donkey Kong for the original Game Boy. Now,
I did not know about this game.
You didn't know about this? Okay, so
by 1994, I was all in on PC gaming. I wasn't.
Well, so here's the thing, right? So Donkey Kong, the original, right, came out in like 1981. Like really a long time ago, right? Yeah. I was right, 1981. The Game Boy came out in 1989, and so why in 1994, when the Game Boy is 5 years old, it's like only now do they finally think to release their oldest, most historic, first ever Nintendo game on the Game Boy. It's like it was one of the first Nintendo games for the NES/Famicom, right? It was on other systems too, like a 7800. Who in 1994 would shell out whatever the price of a Game Boy game was, $40-$50 for just Donkey Kong? The game is just called Donkey Kong.
But that's it. By the year 1994, we had a Game Boy, we had a Game Gear. We weren't buying like more games for the Game Boy. We had a lot of games for our Game Boy.
I'm just saying, like, but even if you were buying Game Boy games in 1994, why would you buy Donkey Kong?
Yep.
Which is, it just says Donkey Kong. You look at it and you're like, this is just Donkey Kong. The arcade one, that same game. Why would you buy this? And so the TV commercial did mention something, at least the US TV commercial did mention something about like 100 extra levels, which is, but it didn't, it was so fast and, you couldn't really tell what was going on. This game is like a genius game. You start playing it, and sure enough, it is Donkey Kong. There it is, level 1 of Donkey Kong with the ladders and he's throwing the barrels at you. But the controls are much nicer than the old Donkey Kong. And you could actually fall down and not die. It's a little bit different. You could press B to like throw away the hammer if you don't want it anymore. So it's a little bit different if you figure that out than original Donkey Kong. But other than that, it's like it feels exactly the same. And you play it and you're like, all right, I'm just playing Donkey Kong. Why did I spend $50? It looks like Donkey Kong. What's wrong with me? After you beat Donkey Kong for the first time, the game basically busts open with a cutscene and everything into a completely different game that is still Mario chasing Donkey Kong, but it's basically a puzzle platformer where in every level you have to get a key and bring it to the key door, and every world introduces, like, every time you basically catch Donkey Kong and beat him up and then he runs away again, new mechanics are introduced to the game constantly.
See, I've never played this.
And there's cutscenes that demo the different mechanics to you each time. And there really are like 100 levels and like a shit ton of mechanics. So if you've never played it and you have Switch Online, you should play this game. And if you enjoy that game, there's the Mario versus Donkey Kong series that they have, right? This is actually the first game in that series. Mario versus Donkey Kong didn't come out until, I think, on the GBA in 2004, so 10 years later, right? But that GBA game that's called Mario vs. Donkey Kong, is actually really the sequel to original Game Boy Donkey Kong. It's the same thing. It's a puzzle platformer where Mario has to get a key and bring it to a door, right? Mm-hmm. And so this game is excellent. I think it's overlooked. I don't know why Nintendo didn't put it out on Switch Online earlier, but better late than never. And I played it again.
I'm going to play it basically immediately because I have never played this.
I played it only. I didn't actually own it. I played it at a friend's house, and when it was like new, this friend had bought it, and I played it. And I'm like, why did you buy that? Isn't it just Donkey Kong? And then I looked, and I'm like, that's not just Donkey Kong. But I looked at the cartridge, and sure enough, the cartridge just said Donkey Kong on it. And I'm like, whoa, I got fooled. And I played it, later, but it's been 30 years since this game came out. So I remembered it being like a special different thing, but I actually played it on Switch Online. I beat the first 2 worlds last night, and I was like, this is actually better than I had remembered. It's kind of amazing that they did that with a Game Boy. if you compare it to like Mario Land, it's like, is that really the same console that played both these games?
It's analogous to if you played NES games prior to the memory mapping chips versus
Yeah,
after
you played
the
like
memory
you played like
mapping.
Mario 1 and then you played Kirby's Adventure and you're like, these are both the NES? What
Forget
the
Mario
fuck?
1, played like Balloon Fighters, and then you played
Yeah.
Mario 3.
Play baseball and then play bases loaded. Same console.
So in another news, YouTube has added something that's not really for us. Like, it's not something I would use, but this is a good accessibility thing, so I'm glad it's here. This is the kind of use of machine learning and artificial intelligence that I think is good for people. They are adding auto dubbing to YouTube videos. It's still rolling out in stages across languages. So you could watch a video someday. They haven't done this for our channel yet, as far as I can tell. I checked. But
What does our dub voice sound like?
well, I can't wait to find out because it might be really funny. I want to listen to GeekNights in German and French and see what
Is
happens.
it like, is it a Siri kind of voice, or does it actually try to like figure out what I would sound like if I could speak Chinese?
Yep, and that I do not know because this is pretty new and it's not widely rolled out yet. They've just announced that this is a thing they're going to be rolling out and expanding, but they'll auto dub cross languages on top of what has already existed for a long time. If you're unaware, and I occasionally find people who don't know this is a thing, if you're watching a YouTube video that's not in English, because you're listening to Geek Nights, I assume you speak English, and you just click on the subtitles, there will almost always be a bunch of other options because the auto-generated subtitles are also auto-translated with varying success into a bunch of languages. And it's pretty good. Like, we watch some channels, like there's
Not
this.
the worst. Yeah, but when you really need it, it's there for you.
Yep, like
to do something.
That's a good way to put it. If you really need it, it's there. So this is a cool use of that kind of technology, and I cannot wait to see what a Geek Nights video sounds and looks like when this finally hits our site, which as of right now, it is not on our channel. One last little technology news. This will actually probably impact any of you who work in certain technology sectors before too long. So, of course, as you know, the U.S. is going super shitty and attacking our allies, but Canada is actually willing to fight back. Canada has basically announced that if there's a trade war, they're going to win it. So, independent of all the nonsense we're doing with tariffs, Ontario has put a 25% tax on all electricity exports to the U.S. Now, if you don't live in the Northeast, you might think, how much electricity does Canada export to the United States? And the answer to that question is, you have no fucking idea how much electricity. Oh my God. Ontario is where Niagara Falls is. Where one of the biggest power plants in the world is, generating shit tons of electricity in Canada that powers the Northeast. This is a huge deal that will likely impact data centers and thus impact the price of computing in ways that we can only begin to try to process. And this is just the start of this escalating trade war. But anyway, things of the day. So since I figured it's topical to our main bit on MIDI, I got a little video. This is just a minute long, and this is a sort of demo of what it's like to use MIDI on a computer back in the era of the Sound Blaster AW32 or Advanced Wave Effects 32 sound card, because sound cards were a thing. But back in the day, if you had a sound card, it could play regular audio, like wave files, like play audio as you and I and like people.
PCM.
Yeah, PCM. What you all think of as audio coming out of a computer. But back then, the other way sound cards would make noises is they actually basically had a synthesizer in them, and they would play back MIDI instructions via various mechanisms that may or may not have actually involved MIDI, depending on how you used it.
We'll talk about in the main bit.
Yep, they would make music. But what almost no one outside of professional musicians knew was how to configure and like do all this stuff, like for real. So this is what it looked like if you opened up those tools and started swapping what samples were in the memory banks of your sound card. And it is apropos, playing the MIDI file that is the music from Doom. And this person is just flipping through various different sound banks, which radically changes what this sounds like while you're playing the music. This is really archaic stuff that doesn't matter to any normal person anymore in the modern era, what's happening in this video. So I thought it was a cool little demo of what that was like. I lived that world when I was young. So what do you got?
Well, I got 2 videos. I saw these 2 different YouTube videos separately. They're from separate channels. They have no connection between them other than the topics, right? In one video, there is a guy in Buffalo, New York, who has been buried in snow, as you do in Buffalo, New York. And this gentleman has modified his own home with his own project that he designed and built with a bunch of money, it looks like.
Oh, shit, this is way more complex than I thought it was going to be.
Right, but this dude set up something that is impressive, which is that he has made a system in his own driveway to where he basically heats and circulates a liquid through pipes in his driveway to slowly melt snow so he doesn't have to shovel the driveway or deal with ice and such. But it does sometimes have the problem where, it's like an igloo effect where, it melts the bottom layer, but then you can't melt any more than that because it's basically what's underneath is like, right? And so he has to go out there and chop it up a little bit. But you got that guy, right? Which it's cool. It's impressive that they built this, but also it feels like that's like a big waste of energy and money. Like,
unless you've got like a source of waste heat. Like a data center running in your basement.
This dude looks like he's just using, he's burning fossil fuels, right? I don't know. Maybe he's got solar or something. I don't know. But it doesn't seem great for the environment, right? But it is impressive. And here's another person in, I think, Texas, right? With the exact opposite. So it's like we like Buffalo and we don't like Texas. We like melting snow. We don't like lawns, right? But yet, we do love, I guess, home projects like this from nerdy people who build things regardless. But the dude in Buffalo is wasting energy and possibly hurting the environment just to be lazy. The dude in Texas, right, has a lawn that we can approve of. He set up a system where basically by digging trenches and getting his, lawns, he'd be like lower, and then putting some pipes underneath the sidewalk. When it rains, instead of all the water just like flowing away and going away, it floods his lawn, and he grows, things in his lawn in basically a desert in Texas by forcing the water to stick around and not go away, and doesn't waste a bunch of water by using, water from the water system
that had to be processed and pumped in from somewhere.
Yeah, and it's like, if every single person in his neighborhood did this, would there be enough water? I don't know.
No,
but
that's what I was about to say, because my mom for a while lived in Arizona. She does not live there now because Arizona's gonna have a problem. but in many places in the U.S., I do not know about the place in Texas where he is. It is mega fucking illegal to divert water like this, or even to collect water. Like even putting a barrel under like the eaves of your roof is illegal in those places because you don't have a right to that water.
Yeah. So I mean, first of all, he does show in the video where the water would go if he didn't collect it, and it's not being used. So
well, it might be used downstream in the environment is the problem. But again, I don't know.
Potentially. But he's basically showing that, like, this water is basically just going away into the, he's the whole beginning of the video is him showing where the water would go if he didn't do this, right? But it's like, if your whole street did this and you're at the top of the street, you're going to get water first, and the next guy's going to get less water, and the next guy's going to get less water, right? So I don't know how scalable this is, but at least for one guy to do it and have a lawn where he's growing all kinds of stuff in a desert, and it's like, hey, that's actually kind of okay.
Oh, hey, it's near San Antonio, the only part of Texas I know even a little.
Yeah. So.
All right.
Yeah, I think oh, that's right. It goes. You reminded me because it's San Antonio. It goes basically into the San Antonio River,
No.
and then it goes away. That Riverwalk water just isn't used. It just goes down the river.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know anything about Texas law, but in other states, the fact that the river is the place that water goes would make it like 10 times more illegal to do this.
Oh, I don't know anything about that, but the
Not
guy.
my problem. It's still a cool
Yeah,
project.
he even went and talked to a river dude in the video,
Yeah.
like a municipal river employee.
So in the meta moment, Geek Nights is going to be live at PAX East 2025 with not one, but two panels, both of which are finally brand new ones we have never done before, meaning we have to write them now. So on Friday at PAX East, we will be doing The Everlasting Game, which is a broad, basically games that survive repeat play and or lifestyle games and like the longevity of games broadly. We have to write it. We've talked about it a lot, but we never like did a talk on it. So I figure it's a good one. And on Sunday, game mechanics in tabletop design. Basically, way back, we did that mastering game mechanics talk that you wrote. I wrote the other one, the Practically Game Theory. And to this day, it's like one of our most popular talks. But I watched it again recently, and like we say some good stuff. But I think you and I have both learned a lot about games since PAX East 2011. So I think it's time to do a more refined, distilled version of what are all the different game mechanics in tabletop and what do they mean? And like sort of a refresh of an ancient talk with a little more focus and a lot more wisdom and experience.
All right. How about your book club?
Oh, you want the book club? All right. So...
Well, we got something.
But before that, I will also be, without Scott, live at, I didn't post the schedule, ZenkaiCon, not this coming weekend, but the following weekend, next weekend. I will be at ZenkaiCon 2025 doing a bunch of talks by myself, and every other moment I am not doing talks at ZenkaiCon, I will be in tabletop playing games. So if you happen to be at ZenkaiCon in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, hit me up. I got nothing to do but hang out and play board games with board game people, and I have a small crew of board game people to play board games with, meaning we could probably fit another person or two at our table.
Fit a few shady maples in your stomach.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And maybe buy some contraband eggs to sneak back to New York with me on the way home.
Do the Amish have cheap eggs? Are they not? They're not jacking up their prices?
I mean, I don't know, actually.
Oh, okay. Because Costco, I got 2 dozen for $8 and change, and at the regular grocery, it was like $4 for like 6 eggs.
Yeah, I haven't looked at what because we use eggs less than we used to anyway. So I actually haven't looked at what eggs cost for us right now in a while.
Well, the best deal where we live is $8 for 24 at Costco.
Which I think that's fine. That's a decent price for.
I mean, it used to be $1 and change a dozen at the grocery store.
You know,
right?
There's a good Kyrgyzstan video. I think I'll use this thing today later, but it points out why certain things like eggs and meat are so cheap and like sort of how and why that's subsidized. And arguably, it is a big problem that those things are actually probably too cheap, which is leading to a lot of waste.
In the specific case of eggs, they're not that subsidized. At least I don't know about how subsidized they are. But the reason the prices have gone up and stayed up is not because of lack of supply or a lack of profits or anything like that. It's because there's basically a monopoly effectively on every part of the egg supply chain. And they've decided that no one can stop them from just keeping the prices up. They had an excuse to raise the prices, the bird flu, and then just said, well, we make more money keeping the prices up than we do putting them back, and we still sell the same number of eggs or enough eggs. We make more money this way, so F you.
Well, that's part of the subsidy because the subsidy is not direct money. The subsidy is because things are cheap, a lot of waste gets tolerated, and if prices go up, people buy fewer of the thing because they didn't actually need that many anyway, and a lot they were just throwing away. The amount of food people just throw away who aren't like us living in the suburbs is terrifying in America.
Right. The point is that the price of eggs is up because of monopolies, not because of anything else.
Yep.
Right?
So for the book club, because Scott wasn't enthusiastic about the Moomin Trolls, the theme for the choices.
Don't blame it on me. I would have read it. You just didn't.
You weren't enthusiastic enough. So
okay.
The theme here is apocalypses. So I have
There's
two
plenty,
books.
no shortage of books about that.
So I have two books that are about apocalypses. What I will say before I announce them is that, because you get to choose, one of them is an optimistic look at an apocalypse, or at least that's the broad way I'd frame it. And the other
Mad
one
Max the novel?
is a more pessimistic approach to an apocalypse. They're
Logan's
both,
Run the novel?
They're both somewhat timely. I think they're both pretty good, and I would be happy to read either one. So which one do you want to hear about first? The more positive one or the more sad one?
I don't really care.
All right. So one option is we could read The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which I've never actually read. Comes up a lot in
We already
conversation.
did a Margaret Atwood. We did the Oryx and Crake one.
Yeah.
Which
is
is
also
sort of
an apocalypse.
An apocalypse, kind of.
But remember, if you are not familiar with what The Handmaid's Tale is actually about, an important point, it is not just about basically what if the Republicans took over America for real. It is also a futuristic dystopian novel. It is set in the near future, and that is a big part of what this book is about. I think it's worth reading. I think it's topical.
You could, it could be set in the near future from when it was written, which might be the present.
Which was 1985.
Yeah.
So, but think about some other near future works from that era, like RoboCop.
Mm-hmm.
So the other option
that seems accurate.
So, RoboCop isn't even. It is very interesting to me that RoboCop wouldn't even read as a parody. The things that happen in RoboCop feel tame compared to what's actually happening. But the other option, this is a book that Emily was recommending to me, Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune from the years 2052 to 2072. And basically it's set in, say there was a fucked up apocalypse in the U.S. Like the
so it's not, even though the title sounds like it, it's fiction.
It's fiction. But
Okay.
it is sort of an account of...
Title sounds like a nonfiction title.
How do things get rebuilt, and like how did people react to and deal with in New York, like New York City, an apocalypse. Emily read about half of it and said it was pretty fantastic. And I feel like this is the one you're going to pick, but you never know. I'm giving you two options here.
I mean, it's true. I haven't read Handmaid's Tale, even though I know plenty about it and enjoyed Margaret Atwood. But, we already did the Margaret Atwood, right? We got to mix it up.
I don't want to do so. If I finally sneak an Umberto Eco book in, then it's going to be the only one I get.
I'm not opposed to Umberto Eco. That's a name of an author I know that's famous.
You denied me Foucault's Pendulum twice, which is the only reason we haven't done it as the book club.
You put it against something shitty instead. I'm not anti.
All
I know is that the Umberto Eco is the name of a famous author.
Tell you what, next time your choice will
I wouldn't know them if I wouldn't know them if I met
your
them on the
choice will
street.
either be Foucault's Pendulum or one of these 500-page books.
You could just do two Umberto Ecos, and then I got to pick one of them.
I could. Anyway, you don't have to decide right now. One of those two books will be the book. I assume you're going to go with Everything for Everyone. I'll read a note from the description.
Who says I might not read both, though?
Every socialist needs to read this book. Every abolitionist, every Marxist, every anarchist.
I guess I have to read it then.
Every revolutionary needs to read this book.
Well, that's me.
In the middle of the 21st century, war, famine, economic collapse, and climate catastrophe have toppled the world's governments. In the 2050s, the insurrectionists reached the
You said this book was fiction, though.
Oh, I mean, it might be prescient. We might have to dig up James Randi and tell him we found one.
This is sounding like nonfiction. I might have to pick the other book, which I know is fiction.
In the 2050s, the insurrection reached the nerve center of global capitalism, New York City. This book is a collection of interviews with people who made the revolution.
This is how that's the first reason I know that it is fiction, because the revolution wouldn't eventually reach New York City. It would start.
I mean, not to get into current geopolitics, but it is, all I'm going to say, and I'm going to say it is, the chances are not high, but it is plausible that the new civil war in the U.S. could start over New York City's congestion pricing. Because our governor has basically indicated she will ignore a federal rule on this, but TBD.
Finally, my emails worked.
Yep. What is New York City, like Philadelphia and Boston, cities known for the complacency of their citizens in the face of outrages from external forces.
Oh, okay, this person who wrote this book was right about a lot of things, but they have not been to a city.
That was a directly and specifically sarcastic statement.
Ah, okay.
Known for their complacency is italicized.
Oh, you didn't pronounce the italics. Okay, then.
All right, I think this will be the book, so I'll make all the posts and everything when I get a chance. Let's dive into the main bit. So, brief history of music on computers in the context of MIDI. Back in the 80s,
You got to start before computers, right?
True, because this does predate computers.
Right, back in the old days, you had synthesizers, right? The synthesizer, we can't do a show on synthesizers right now, but basically it's an electronic device that basically you have an oscillating electrical signal. And if you take an oscillating signal and send it to a speaker, noise comes out.
Yep.
So you put a bunch of electronics in between the oscillator and the speaker, and you can adjust that wave in any way that you can devise with the electronic components available to you to make conceivably any sound.
Yep.
And that's a synthesizer. And so the problem is you want to play some fucking music. You can't just have one sound going, you could. That's not great music.
That arguably is music, but it's not the kind of music we're talking about.
It's not music you want to listen to. You want to be able to play notes. And so the way a synthesizer works is that there's an envelope. And when you press keys, you open the envelope and let the wave through. And you also adjust the pitch, the frequency to change which sound it is. And so most synthesizers that you'll see are going to be built into a keyboard.
Yep.
Right? There's a keyboard and a synthesizer in one device, and you play it. And that's just an electronic piano, basically.
I had 3 different synthesizers in my childhood of increasing sophistication because I was very much into music production when I was very young.
Okay, so now you have a computer, and you want the computer to play noise, right? Music, all kinds of sounds. And the problem is, if you want to take recorded music and play it, you have to store the entire recording, like, a wave file, basically, and that's big. And if you don't store the entire wave file, you want to save space, you have to use like an MP3 or something, in which case, you saved a lot of space, but now you need CPU to decompress that. And so old computers, they neither had space nor CPU to spare.
To give you some context, an album, like on a CD, like a little under like 50-ish, 55 minutes of music, that's about 600 megabytes, which was...
If they fill the album all the way.
Yeah, that was bigger than the hard drive on the computer we had in our house.
Yep. And so the solution for old computers, some of them just had a beeper that literally could only go beep.
Yeah,
right. The PC.
I still
speaker.
have a PC speaker I can plug into the header because a lot of motherboards still have the header.
Well, it's important because you might need to hear error codes depending on the motherboard, right? But anyway, the solution was to basically put a synthesizer into your computer. So now you can make any sound that your synthesizer can make. You just can store instructions to tell the synthesizer, hey, play a C# for 2 seconds. Hey, do this, adjust the sound in this way and do that. And so, for example, an NES can do, I forget exactly what voices it has, but it has like 2 square waves, a triangle wave,
and the PCM.
The static, the noise. It has 4 or 5, I think, right? And between those, you can make pretty damn good music. Mega Man 2 soundtrack, right?
Yeah.
Was made with just those 4 or 5 synthesizer voices, and that's it. So that's pretty damn good, and you don't need to take up a lot of space or processing power because you just have a small, tiny program that's like, play this note for this long, this note for this long, do this, do that, just these small instructions, and you just run through them really quickly.
Now, MIDI was not designed for this purpose. This is what anyone listening to GeekNights would know MIDI as, and we can talk about that a lot. But MIDI did not require personal computers. Where MIDI was mostly used, and where I used MIDI before I had a computer that could speak MIDI directly. I had a synthesizer. I actually had 2 synthesizers at the time when I was very young, and I had MIDI cables. These just 5-pin DIN-looking things. You've seen these cables around. There's a lot of other things that use the same...
You can use TRS cables from MIDI nowadays.
I never fucking saw a TRS MIDI in my entire life.
That's what I'm using, but you can. Most people still are just using the big ones
Yep.
for a lot of things.
And that 5-pin DIN is
You
used
can also
by
do USB MIDI these days too.
Yep. But back then you couldn't. USB didn't exist yet. Computers had serial ports and parallel ports. That was it. And MIDI was just these cables. So what I would do is I had one synthesizer, and if I played notes, the synthesizer was in a keyboard. And if I played notes on the keyboard, the keyboard would play synthesizer sounds out of its own speakers, and I could plug the keyboard into a stereo system, recording system, whatever, to record or do something with that sound. But every time I touched those keys, it would also send the telemetry about my key presses out its MIDI hole. So I plugged that MIDI hole into my other synthesizer, so I could use my big keyboard to play different sounds from what it could do with its own synthesizer out of the other synthesizer. And I could even do more. You could even daisy chain these together and tell different synthesizers along the way to listen to different channels. And then I could basically have one synthesizer playing like backing tracks and a different synthesizer playing what I was playing, and they'd all merge together at the end of this chain into output from a hi-fi system.
Yep. So yeah, the original purpose of MIDI was actually pre-computer, like Rim said. People had synthesizers that didn't even have keyboards attached to them. It was just like a rack mount thing, right? And it's like, well, how do you play that? Well, you could get a keyboard that's just a keyboard and doesn't even have a synthesizer in it. It's just a bunch of keys, and then plug it in there, and now you can play it. And now you don't need to fill your office with like 100 different keyboards in your music studio. You could have a few or one, and then you can have an array of synthesizers and other music devices, drum machines, whatever it is, and you can play them all because you have MIDI controllers and you have MIDI hosts. And that's the way MIDI works, is there are controller devices, and you can think of it as the same way you think about like your game console. There's a game controller and there's the console, and you can use the same controller with a bunch of different game consoles, and it works.
Now, why
so you use the same keyboard
thing with these special like 5-pin DINs and these pass-throughs and everything? One, most of these devices had to be stupid. You needed them to daisy chain without any of the devices to have like computing logic inside of them. This had to work electrically. And two, you needed to be able to send 16 channels worth of telemetry.
Well, it's 16 channels because you can have up to 16 basically instruments.
16 channels was basically the default of MIDI. So a lot of stuff was built around that. There are extended ways to have banks of channels and other nonsense that I barely remember how to do. But this all had to work without computers being involved. It was also used because this same concept could control things that aren't an instrument, and MIDI was really easy to make hardware for. It was an open standard. You could read the specs, solder some shit together, and make something that worked.
Before MIDI, all the music companies had their own proprietary thing, right? Eventually, they were just like, fuck it, we're going to make this. I think it was Roland and this other guy. And some, there's some story behind it, and they basically said, this is how it's going to be, right? And everyone got on board with it, and it became the standard. And that same standard from way back then is still the standard now. It's been added to. MIDI 2.0 is sort of a thing, kind of, but that's super recent, and it's mostly backwards compatible. And you can never get away from this just because there's so much MIDI equipment out in the music world that people really depend on.
Oh, yeah.
We're stuck with it forever.
So club lighting, stage lighting, entire theaters in some cases are all wired up for these 5-pin MIDI cables, because MIDI was also used. There's something called MIDI show control. I had to look up the name of it because I haven't thought of this stuff since I was a kid. But MIDI was kind of like USB is today, really easy to just implement. So if you need to control the lighting in a club, you could just use MIDI to do that instead of doing it manually, and people did, and there was a standard for it. MIDI was used for a lot of automation by people who weren't fancy enough to use more advanced things or build their own. MIDI was just kind of a useful, easy standard to use to do any arbitrary 16-channel control of anything.
Yep. So over time, right, it started out just as having keyboards, synthesizers. You can control any synth with any keyboard, right? Over time, people started to realize that the separation of concerns of having a host that just does a thing when it receives instructions, and a controller that sends instructions, opened up a world of possibilities, mostly in music, but as Rim said, not all in music. So some of the possibilities, right? Obviously, you have a computer as a synthesizer. Now you can plug a keyboard into a computer and play the synthesizer that's in your computer. I knew people who had like Commodore 64 and a keyboard, and they would play, right? And it would work.
This was a big deal. In those days, a bunch of computers came with MIDI ports by default because the music industry was adopting this so heavily. Like, that was a big part of how computers were used back then. Funnily enough, later computers in the 90s, like Windows PCs, it was actually a lot harder to do this. I had to spend a lot of money to get enough equipment, not just a Sound Blaster All32, but like a MIDI controller and all the other stuff to plug my keyboard into my Windows computer to make
now
it
you got
all work.
USB MIDI, so you're all good.
Yep.
But anyway,
There's some old pictures I could try to get my mom to send me of like all these cables strewn across the house connecting all my synthesizers to the computer.
The other thing that people started to do is by separating those concerns, people started to make different control devices and different host devices. So, and the host devices were mostly things that made sound, you know?
Yep.
So it's like, you know, it's mostly synthesizers, but it could be any kind of sound making thing. Like you could get theoretically like a whole row of like wine glasses and jugs with like little air blowers and control and have put a MIDI host on there. And then any MIDI controller could come along and play the giant array of jugs and wine glasses. Right? It's possible.
One thing I used it for a while is, so I had a collection of MIDI files, which we'll get to in a minute. So I had a lot of MIDI files, like thousands of them. I had this huge curated collection. I was obsessed with MIDI. So I had a lot of files of famous people's like famous or good musicians playing songs on the piano. So I connected the computer to our giant standing like digital piano via MIDI cables, I used it as a player piano because that thing sounded way better than the speakers hanging off of our like 486.
Yep. So yeah, the other thing is that there was, you know, there's innovation on the host side, but the controller side innovation is really wild, right? It's like, well, who says I have to use a keyboard? I just need something that has any input device that I can imagine. Right? You can make an electronic saxophone where you blow into it and that makes it play a note and it looks at what buttons are holding down. You know, electronic flute, electronic trumpet.
What do you think early drum pads were? They were just sending MIDI signals when you hit the different things on the drum pads.
Yeah, when you do percussion, the way it works is there's actually a MIDI standard for percussion where, because obviously there's no notes, right? It's just you're either hitting the drum or you're not.
Yep.
So the way percussion works with MIDI is it actually takes one whole channel and each note is assigned to a different percussive instrument. So it's like I don't know which one it is, but it'll be like A is the triangle and B is the bass and
I knew
C
some people,
is
I
the
couldn't
snare.
do this. I knew some people in middle school who could play the drum set on a regular piano keyboard because they had just like gotten used to that. But normal people would use something other than a piano keyboard to do it.
Yeah. Depending on what you're doing, right? You know, you could just play one instrument at a time, right? You play one, it starts looping, you play the other one, right? And you get them going like that. But that's how MIDI with percussion works. But for most things, it's like, you have notes, octaves, etc.
Yep.
But you could devise musical instruments, and people have, that don't look anything like, or any real world musical instrument, because real world music instruments are constrained by the fact that they actually have to produce noise.
Yep.
Here, it's like you just need a human interface device that can interface with someone's hands, feet, teeth, tongue, whatever part of their body they've got, brain, I don't know,
and
that
piano
translates
keyboard
into
is just,
notes,
is just a
durations.
keyboard.
Yeah.
One of many.
And so there are many such devices available out there, and some of them are really fascinating. And especially with, I think they call it like MIDI expressive something, you know, it lets you like, you know, it's pressure sensitive, it's velocity sensitive. You can bend the notes, right? Like if you got, the guitar, it's like you can really, it's not just like in the original days, it was literally just like beep, boop, boop,
So
right?
I
You're
used
either
to
playing the note or
score.
you're not.
I used to do a lot of arrangement. Like I would make arrangements for the high school band, and I used MIDI to do that. So like I would,
Yep.
because MIDI files, because there's telemetry. If you had software, like back then, I think Cakewalk Studio is what most people used. I had a
I think people
pirated,
still use that.
yeah, but I used it back then, and I had a pirated copy of it. We all had the same pirated copy that we downloaded from the same BBS in my school, and you could just draw notes on sheet music, and the computer would play them. You could play a piano and it would just record like a keyboard. And then I would sit there and I would arrange music, and then I would futz with the MIDI files and like add some flange, add some reverb, change the envelopes on these notes, and just try to make them sound more and more realistic. There was a big hobby in that era in the 90s of people on the internet taking MIDI files and passing them around and taking turns trying to optimize them to make them sound as realistic as possible. People pass around sample packs to load into your Sound Blaster All-32, and they'd say, hey, load this sample pack and play this MIDI file, and I swear to God, it'll sound like real music. Like, that was a whole hobby. And
Yeah.
I collected MIDI files. I had thousands of them that I downloaded over the years and curated and futzed with. They're all on that hard drive that died, so I don't have any
Yep.
backup.
Yeah. So I mean, a MIDI file is
It was
literally
like a
just
megabyte at most.
yeah. It's literally just like somebody was played a MIDI controller, right? So you have the data about which notes to play for how
Yep.
long and whatever. But instead of recording the sound that you're eventually going to produce, you just write that down. It's basically sheet music in a digital form. And then now you don't have to play the piano or the keyboard again every single time. You can just send the already written down instructions from a MIDI controller to any MIDI host and be like, hey, synthesizer. And he'd be like, yeah, I recorded someone playing on a keyboard, and here it is. Here's what they played. And the synthesizer would just play it. And that's a MIDI file.
Yep.
So you can take that same song and send it to any MIDI host, and you could make it like, okay, play this melody on and use the guitar sound. All right, now use the piano sound. Now use the super awesome trance techno sound, right? And there you go.
Yeah. And in that era, if you played computer games, like pretty much any computer game that had music was just playing MIDI. And thus, everyone who played the same game, depending on what hardware they owned, the game would sound completely different.
Yep. I mean, it's the synthesizers what's actually making the noise. So Doom comes with MIDI files, right?
Yeah.
And those MIDI files say, hey, play, right? But if you have one synthesizer, if you have a Sound Blaster 16, it'll sound the way God intended. But if you don't, it'll sound quite different.
Yep. I think the point of perfection where they hit like the plateau of it's not only good enough, but it's great, was the Sound Blaster AW32, the Advanced Wave Effects 32.
The last one.
Yep. Well, they did make an AW64.
They had the Sound Blaster Live, which I had, but
Yep,
basically
that was after the 64.
The Sound Blaster Live I had did have a bunch of MIDI stuff and sound fonts and all
Yep.
this stuff in it, but at that point in computing in the late 90s, you were doing everything PCM. No, people weren't really using MIDI anymore.
Yep,
right?
not
At
for
least
that.
unless they were musical producers, in which case they're still using MIDI today. But people just playing games, visiting website,
That's
whatever they were
why
doing with
I
their
had
computer.
the Sound Blaster Live, because at RIT, remember in that digital music class, one of my classes, me and Katsu, we had to make music in the studio using all that MIDI shit, and I didn't want to use the lab, so I did it at home with that piano. So yeah, it's MIDI is a cool thing that is still in use. If you are at all a musical person, I would recommend seeing what you could do with MIDI. Your computer has a lot of capabilities, and there is a lot of cheap and free software that will let you do cool stuff, and even just let you plug a keyboard into your computer and go nuts on it.
Yeah, there's, you'd be surprised, like software you might just have on your computer, like say shitty old GarageBand.
Yeah.
It's like you can plug a MIDI controller, a USB MIDI controller into your computer and just start playing instruments in GarageBand. Like it just instantly works without any configuration. You could even plug one into like your iPad, which has GarageBand. It's free.
Yep.
You could buy various cheap and tight, because now, hardware is smaller these days, right? And it's less expensive. All the major audio companies, right? Your Korgs, your Rolands, your all those guys, right? There is a lot of different MIDI controllers you can buy, and also, you know, MIDI little tiny synthesizers, little drum machines, and groove boxes, and all sorts of things that you can get really cheap. And you can get them used from people who tried to get into the hobby and then quit and save money, right? And you can connect those things together with MIDI and have a fun time making beat boops or whatever, even if they're not any good. Who cares? You know, unless you're trying to actually have a music career, in which case, yeah, then you care. But if you're not, whatever, right? Just have a fun time.
It's so much easier than it used to be. Getting MIDI stuff to work with computers used to be really hard, and you had to know a lot about MIDI. These days,
And
it'll
you need
mostly
to pay
just
for
work.
software or get it somewhere.
Yeah. No, but like even like how to arrange the order of things you daisy chain would matter. All that stuff doesn't really matter anymore.
You'll still have to maybe like choose a MIDI channel like now, like if you've got like let's say you've got a controller and you've got like, you know, 3 devices you want to play at once. You have to be like, okay, listen, you're gonna be channel 1 and you're gonna be channel 2 and you're gonna be 3, and you say, okay, play this on 1 and this on 2 and this on 3, and that's about the hardest configuration you're gonna have to deal with.
And done.